Hello there, and welcome so much for joining us for another edition of the Mass Citizens for Life virtual speaker series. My name is Myrna Maloney Flynn. I have the honor of serving as President and CEO of Massachusetts Citizens for Life. Today, we have a really special presentation from Sean Corcoran, who is the CEO of Men for Life. And he is going to be talking about the very critical role that every man plays in the fight to protect unborn life and the fight to provide alternatives for women that are grounded in love and truth. Before we hear from Sean, I want to remind those of you who are watching that if you have not signed up yet to join one of our action teams, please head to masscitizensforlife.org/teams and take a look. We are working very hard to reinvigorate the grassroots component of our mission. And we know that the culture of Massachusetts will change when we successfully educate and mobilize every voter across the state. So we need your help to make that happen. So by way of our grassroots action teams in each of the 160 legislative districts, we are drilling down into the community level and educating and mobilizing. And whether it is speaking to other men on behalf of our most vulnerable, whether it is teaching others about the humanity of the unborn and talking about the science of fetal development, or talking to other people about what the laws of Massachusetts really are, laws that people don't know that exist and that are very dangerous and deadly. The grassroots level is where cultural change will happen, and we need your help to do that. So again, visit us at masscitizensforlife.org/teams, sign up for the action team in your district, and we'll be in touch and let you know how you can help. So thank you in advance for your partnership. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Sean Corcoran, who, as I mentioned, is CEO of Men for Life. Now, Sean draws on his personal experience of losing his first child to abortion, and in his work to change the culture by restoring biblical masculinity. He equips men to speak boldly and stand confidently for life, family, and faith. He currently lives in Louisiana with his wife, Dr. Michelle Corcoran, and their 5 children. Sean, thank you so much for taking some time to join us. I know you're incredibly busy, and I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Myrna. I appreciate this opportunity. I think it's great to have the chance to share this, especially on Father's Day, but with an audience in Massachusetts. And I want to kind of I know I told you where I was going to start, but you said something that I think a couple of things that I think are really important. You said that your goals are to educate and mobilize. And I think that that is a really big deal because so many times in the pro-life movement, what we say is we will win when we change the culture. Okay. But change the culture isn't trackable. Like there's no way that we can know whether or not we change the culture. We can see how our kids answer questions. We can see how the next generation acts and know that maybe something good is happening. But then we also see everything else that's happening in that younger generation. And then you really don't know, are we changing the culture or not? But that's how we change the culture, right? Is by educating and mobilizing. And at Men for Life, what we say is equipping men to speak boldly and stand confidently for life, family, and faith. And it's the same thing, right? It's equipping is educating, and then mobilizing them to take action because it's passivity and silence of men is my position that has led to the current state of abortion.
That's right.
So I think that educating and mobilizing is a much better way to put it than to say, as we do so often across pro-life, to change the culture. Nobody really knows what that means, and it's a frustrating thing. It sounds really good, and that is what we want to do. But how do we do that is the question. How do we take that action? The other thing you said is that it starts at the grassroots, and that brought me to something that I always share when I talk, even though it's not what I told you I was going to start with, and it's a quote that I heard by a gentleman named Cowboy Dwayne. Generally, when I speak, I ask everyone in the audience if they've heard of Cowboy Dwayne, and no one has ever raised their hand. So I may be the only person that ever watched this podcast before I shared it, but it's really good. And what he said was, he said, this country is only as good as the churches in this country. The churches are only as good as the families that make up those churches. Those families are only as good as the marriages that those families were built upon. And those marriages are only as good and as strong as the husband and the father that God built those marriages on. As goes the husband, so goes the marriage. As goes the marriage, so goes the family. As goes the family, so goes the churches. As goes the churches, so goes the country. And what he says is this country is a failure today because the husbands and the fathers have failed. And you know, and I don't know what our audience believes about whether this country is a failure, but when it comes to abortion, I think we're all clear that this country is failing today. And that's because the husbands and the fathers have failed. And I'll share with you what I mean by that because, you know, it's not something that's commonly said, but I think that abortion is the product of failed masculinity. You know, I think that the reason that in 1972 we had 1 million abortions, I'm sorry, 1975, we had 1 million abortions. And today in 2025, we had 1.126 million abortions. Like we haven't won is because men have by and large sat out passively and silently on the sidelines, even where we can recognize that that abortion is not a women's issue as we are told by the opposition. We've allowed it to become a women's fight. And so that is a silence and passivity, which is a failure of masculinity. And I think that when we look at things like a Gallup poll from June of 2025, that showed that 54% of men in America identify as pro-life, then the question becomes, well, where are they? Right? Like, what are they doing? How are they showing up? You know, are they just answering the poll that they are against abortion, showing up to marches, showing up to banquets, what I call pro-life social events, right? Places where it's safe and comfortable to be pro-life as a man. You know, it's easy to say I'm pro-life in a pro-life event. It's much harder to do it when there's violent opposition, and the opposition is violent. You know, we look at the death of Charlie Kirk, and there's so many more videos of violence um, from the opposition when men, especially, are speaking out against abortion. And so to identify as pro-life, you know, in comfortable places, you know, we're not called to be comfortable. We're commanded to be courageous. And as men, it is important to speak boldly. And the product of speaking boldly, you know, like Cowboy Dwayne said, as we lead in those families, you know, the most grassroots portion of our lives, we lead in our families, and then our families lead in our communities and in our churches, and then that changes the country, and it all goes to the fathers, it all goes to the husbands, it all goes to the men, and so we don't get to sit this out. Like we don't get to be passive because we are leading. You know, I think somewhere like, and I apologize for not having this memorized, but it's somewhere around 80% of a certain population of inmates come from fatherless homes, right? And and then we also know that from multiple studies, this has been replicated for decades, that in families where the father leads in the faith, leads to church, there's a 93% chance of the children continuing to go to church and be in that faith. When it's the mother who leads, it drops to just below 40%. And so that's a really big deal, you know. And if we take those two things and we contrast them, we can really see how the leadership of men, the leadership of husbands, the leadership of fathers, really, really imparts upon the family, on the children, on the next generation. You know, they follow that lead, and so I think it's really important that men recognize that we don't get to be silent, we don't get to be passive. You know, we have to get up and we have to take action and we have to do something. We have to be bold. We have to speak boldly, not just in pro-life social events. We have to speak boldly, you know, when we're out in public. And that's scary, you know, because of the violent opposition. But it's not really our fight. and I know that Massachusetts Citizens for Life is a secular organization, but I draw on my faith in everything that I do, and I think that whether you believe in God and whether you believe in Christianity or whether you believe in the universe or whether you believe in anything, I would suggest that almost everyone who's paying attention to this and is on our side believes in something bigger than ourselves, right? Because if we only believed in ourselves, then it doesn't really matter. I mean, that's what the opposition believes. The opposition believes in a world of self, which is why they are okay, killing innocent humans who get in the way of what it is that they want. And so I would suggest that everyone who's paying attention to this and is on our side believes in something greater than ourselves. And so I think that that's where the real fight comes from. And so we can go out boldly, and speak boldly for life, knowing that the opposition doesn't have any power, because just like it's not about ourselves, it's not about themselves, their selves. And so there's just something greater that's more important. Um, so, I do want to kind of jump into what I did tell you I was going to start with, because I think so many times in the pro-life movement, we we know what abortion is, right? And we know that it's evil. And the problem is that when we see evil, our first inclination is to close our eyes, right? Our first inclination is to put it out of our heads. And we might know that it's over there in the corner, but we don't want to look at it because it's hard. And the problem with that is we can't fight something that we can't see. If we shut our eyes to it and we pray it away or we wish it away, nothing happens because it keeps growing, because the people in the opposition aren't closing their eyes. They're fighting for it. And so it's really important that we not close our eyes to this evil. It's really important that we know what it is that we're fighting. And so I'm going to share something that's going to be difficult to hear, and I can assure you that it's difficult for me to read and to say, but I think that it's the most important thing that we can do if we want to be if we want to be able to win this fight, is to know the evil that we are fighting. And so I'm going to describe the different types of abortion, in very graphically. And so I just think that it's important that we, especially as men, who have allowed this to be a women's fight, just say abortion is bad. You don't kill innocent babies. Well, let's talk about what that means. There's several different kinds of abortion. The first is called a suction abortion. This is when the cervix is dilated and a strong suction, 29 times the power of a household vacuum, tears the baby's body apart and sucks it through the hose into a container. There's a dilation and curettage abortion, where after the dilation of the cervix, a sharp looped knife is inserted into the uterus. The baby's body is cut into pieces and extracted, often by suction. Dilation and evacuation method is where forceps are inserted into the uterus, grabbing and twisting the baby's body to dismember him or her. And if the head is too large, it must be crushed in order to remove it. There's a saline injection where a 20% salt solution is injected through the mother's abdomen into the baby's amniotic fluid. And the baby ingests the solution and dies of salt poisoning, dehydration, and hemorrhaging of the brain. And then, of course, we're all familiar today with the abortion pill, but what the abortion pill is, it's actually two different pills, right? Mifepristone is the first pill, and mifepristone starves the baby of progesterone. It lowers the mom's progesterone so that the baby starves to death. After the baby has starved to death, misoprostol is used to induce labor so that the dead baby, can be delivered. And and there's this huge fight right now about mifepristone, and I think that it's important that while we should fight against mifepristone, it's important that we pay attention to what's really happening, because the opposition is already telling people to do misoprostol only abortions, which means instead of starving the baby to death first, they're just delivering a live embryo, a live baby, and then the baby dies because obviously it can't survive outside of the womb. And so so while it's important to take care of the abortion pill, as it's called, it's really important that we eliminate abortion completely. And we cannot eliminate abortion completely if half of the population is not actively fighting or is willing to believe that this is a women's fight. And we can look at it in a couple of different ways. Yes, abortion is the killing of an innocent human life. We as men should protect, provide, lead, and serve in a way that honors God, right? And so we should be protecting the most vulnerable. The most vulnerable, of course, is the baby. However, we're also called to protect women. And one of the things is so often overlooked is that abortion negatively impacts women. So Dr. Priscilla Coleman did a study and found that 80 women who have an abortion are 81% more likely to have mental health issues. And then there are multiple studies over the course of the last 30 years that show that women who have an abortion are 2 to 6 times more likely to commit suicide, not to attempt suicide, to successfully commit suicide. Abortion negatively impacts women. And so it's important that we as men recognize that if we end abortion, we're not only saving babies, we're saving women. And the only way to eliminate abortion is to ensure the protection and the provision, right, of the women who are currently being led by the opposition to abortion. So there's a lot of work to be done. We can make it illegal all day long, but people will still do illegal things. And so, especially with the abortion pill. And so there's multiple levels that we have to work on here, but none of that can be as effective without men in the fight as it can be with men in the fight. And something else that's important is the impact of abortion on men. You know, 1 in 5 men will lose a child to abortion by the age of 45. Now, that number is probably actually higher because not everyone is getting told. But what we know from a study by Support After Abortion is that 1 in 5 men will lose a child to abortion by the age of 45. These men are not just pro-choice, some of them are pro-life. In this study, it was 50-50. So with 50% identifying as pro-life, 50% identifying as pro-choice, across the board, what this Support After Abortion study found was that 71% of those men noticed adverse changes. Whether they were pro-life, whether they were pro-choice, didn't matter. Noticed adverse changes in their life after the abortion took place. 83% of those men, across ideological lines, said that they would have benefited from someone to talk to. Only 17% said they knew someone to talk to. And and here's a really big thing. Only 7% of those men said that they felt comfortable talking to their pastor. And so, I think that another level of this, which may be appropriate for a different webinar, is the failure of the churches to lead as well. But what's really important is that 71% noticed adverse changes, 83% said that they would have benefited from someone to talk to, but only 17% said that they knew where to go. So abortion impacts men. Way more profound than that, I think, is a study out of Denmark. In this study, to set the tone, Denmark is a decidedly pro-choice country, right? It is not a pro-life country. And so these were not pro-life men in this study. This isn't even a self-reported study. This study was done using socialized medicine. And so all they did was use the numbers, track the data, and came up with this information. And in this study, they studied 192,000 men who had lost a child who had lost a child, either stillborn, miscarriage, abortion, or died, right after birth. Of those, 8,221 of them were from abortion. And what they found was that the men who lost a child to abortion were 4.5 times more likely to seek mental health professionals, 90% increase likelihood in needing antidepressants, 79% more likely to need anti-anxiety medications, and 74% more likely to need prescription sleep aids. And so I think that it's important that we recognize that abortion is is not a women's issue, but not just recognize that because, it can't be a women's issue if it's killing babies, but recognize that it's not a women's issue because it impacts everyone, right? It impacts moms, it impacts families, it impacts dads. Abortion negatively impacts everyone, in addition to killing an innocent baby every single time. And so, that's kind of how I got into what I'm doing today. When I was 19 years old, I was sitting in my dorm room. My girlfriend at the time came and told me that she was pregnant. And, this is 1997. The internet didn't exist in the way that it existed today. There was no social media. You went to the internet to download music very slowly. And so there was no shouting your abortion. I knew what abortion was. I didn't know that anybody that had ever had one. And so when she told me she was pregnant, like I immediately knew that that meant we had a baby coming. And so I started talking through all of the things that this meant for our lives. How is this going to change our lives? We were both freshmen in college. There was going to be significant changes if a baby came. And she stopped me and she said, "Well, no, I'm having an abortion." And, the best I could do was to say no. You're not going to have an abortion, and to say it repeatedly. We're having a baby. We're going to be able to do this. I don't know how we're going to be able to do this, but we're going to be able to do this. And she just let me know that nothing that I said mattered. She was going to have this abortion. And so, the impact on her was significant, to the point where she went and met with a counselor after the abortion because her grades started suffering really badly. And, and that counselor helped her to waive her classes so that she could not fail out of college. And so I went the very next day after she told me that, talked to the very same counselor, told her the very same story. I said, this is the person you spoke to yesterday. This is the situation. This is the resolution you came to. I'm the other part of that. And that counselor told me, no, this does not affect you because you're a man. And keep in mind, I'm 19 and this is a school counselor. So this is a person in a position of authority for me. And so I took that, and I just, it must not affect me. And the problem was that it did affect me, and I failed out of college. I spent the rest of the semester in my dorm room just staring at the wall. I failed out of college. And look, and I want to be clear here, because people will jump on that and say, how could you be so heartbroken over a child that you never met? And I think that we're looking at two different things here. My entire masculinity, my entire identity as a man was stripped when I lost any ability that I had to do the one thing that God put me here to do. More important than anything else was to protect those entrusted to my protection. I had a child who I was unable to protect, and that destroyed me. And so I failed out of college. I moved home. I failed out of another college 2 more times. And 8 years after the abortion, I was lying face down on a hotel room floor overdosing at the end of his 7-year methamphetamine addiction, homeless, unemployed, and waiting for the police to come and arrest me. And by the grace of God only, I didn't die. I woke up the next morning. I hadn't been arrested yet. I was able to get into treatment that day. And in treatment, a counselor, as we're walking through my life, stopped me when I got to the abortion story and said, "We should really talk about this because clearly this affected you." And that was the first time in that 8-year period that I was able to make a connection between all of the negative feelings in my life and all of the behaviors that I was doing to cover up those feelings. And so that counselor helped me to begin to heal, from abortion, and to name my child. I have a son named Michael. To write letters asking for forgiveness from Michael, letters forgiving the mother of my child and my younger self, and to really begin to heal. But the one thing she didn't tell me was, "You're not the only man." And so I still believe, and I didn't know anybody else that had ever been through this. And so I kind of kept that, inside, and I did the things you do when you recover, hopefully, from addiction. And I got out. I went back to college. I went to law school. I married the girl I'd been pursuing for 7 years, and started a law firm, started a family, had 2 children, adopted 3 more. And and then I was on a retreat. And on this retreat, all these men were sharing all these stories, you know, these hardest things that they had ever dealt with, whether it was their fault or not. And I just felt like they were being met with grace and not judgment, and that I could share everything. And so I just unloaded everything on this retreat. And when I did, what I found was that it wasn't about me. You know, as healing as it was to finally be able to share all of that loss, you know, and all of that pain and get it out, it was very cathartic. But afterwards, I had three different men come up to me privately and say, I've never told anybody this, but I lost a child to abortion when I was 19 or 20. And it had been decades, 20 years, 30 years. And they didn't ever know anyone else, any other man. And they all knew each other, but they didn't know any other man who had ever shared that. So all these men are suffering in silence because men don't talk about abortion. And the reason men don't talk about abortion is because men don't talk about abortion. And so that's when I began sharing my abortion story, and and it happens every time. Every time I share, men will come up, or I'll get emails from men who say I've never told anybody. They just don't feel safe. You know, they don't know that this is something that impacts men. You know, and they've been dealing with it, and in many cases, they don't even recognize. There's been men who have said, "Man, you know, I was sober for 25 years before I heard a pastor talk about abortion and realized that that's what drove me to drinking in the first place." Because men just don't talk about it. And so it's really important to me. And I think that that is one way that men lead on this, is to be open and to be bold and to talk about it. And so I began sharing. And then in a couple of years ago, when I stopped practicing law because it was just taking me away from my family too much, and I was looking for the next step, this organization, Men for Life, started asking me if I would come and run it. And you know, when I stopped practicing law, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to do something that allowed me to make enough money to take care of my family, but also be present. And I had no idea how to run a nonprofit. I do know, I did know then from serving on boards that nonprofit leadership is not a lucrative profession. And so I said no. And I said no for about 2 years before God very, very forcefully said, "You're going to go do this." And it was not a question, it was a command. And I was on an airplane on the way to meet with a consultant for a business that was ready to roll out the following week. And on that airplane, God said, "You're going to run this nonprofit." And so that was summer of 24. And I took over this position in August of 24. And the whole goal of Men for Life is to change the culture. But I'm not going to end there, right? Because as we started, like that doesn't mean anything. But to change the culture by restoring authentic masculinity or biblical masculinity and equipping men to speak boldly and stand confidently for life, family, and faith. You know, and that happens at every level. It happens at the level of the men who are watching this webinar. It happens really at the level of the men who come into the pregnancy centers in an unplanned pregnancy. And you know, and we found that 97% of men who come into that pregnancy center with the mom, see an ultrasound, and complete a fatherhood program, choose life. Because these young men are looking for something. Most of them have never had a dad, you know, never had a positive male role model. You know, what they have found in male leadership is, you know, this first people that came out talking about masculinity, people like Andrew Tate, you know, and Dan Bilgerian, you know, guys who I hate the term toxic masculinity, but that's what it is. Like that is toxic masculinity when you're living a life for self and not for others. You know, we weren't put here for self. We were put here for others. You know, and everyone's familiar with the creation story. You know, God put Adam in the garden to tend the garden and to have dominion over the animals, and there was no animal that would serve as a perfect helper or a companion for Adam. And so then Eve was created. And so that is the main obligation of man, is to take care of everyone and everything in his charge. And so it's not to just make a lot of money so that we can build a huge ego, so that we can buy a lot of stuff, so that people will be attracted to the stuff and buy and indirectly, like us, because then we've seen it so many times with these stars who go bankrupt and lose everyone, right? They lose everything, but then they lose everyone. And so that's not real. It's not real to be to say that masculinity is the enemy of femininity, right? To treat women as objects, to say that we are in opposition. We're not in competition with women. Masculine and feminine were meant to complement each other, not to compete with each other. And so I think that that's really important. So how do we do that? How do we live that life? How do we take that action? How do we be bold? How do we, it starts in the family, and I think I always draw the I always draw the comparison when I talk about how abortion is the product of failed masculinity, and it's two things. It's bad men doing bad things, right? That's failed masculinity. It's good men doing nothing, which is failed masculinity. And that second one, I think is even more important because it's way harder to change the bad men doing bad things. We can only control ourselves. We can only control our own circle of influence. And so it's the passivity and silence of men, of good men, that has led to the current state of abortion. And if we go all the way back to the garden and we look at the creation story and we look in Genesis 3 where you know where where Satan does the most impactful thing he can do. He separates the union between God and man and woman. And look, that's happening now, right? Like the attack on man is an attack on the family, attack on the marriage, and that attacks everything. Separating all of that leads to societal destruction in so many ways. But it started in the garden, separating man, woman, and God, and telling the woman, telling Eve the lies, right? That you cannot be good enough. You cannot be strong enough. You cannot be everything that you are created to be unless you do the one thing that God told you not to do. Unless you eat this fruit, you will not be everything you were created to be. Unless you have this abortion, you cannot be everything you were created to be. It's the exact same lie, thousands and thousands and thousands of years later. And what's even more important than that, though, and where the masculinity part comes in is what happened next, where Eve ate the apple and she turned and she gave it to her husband who was there. Adam was right there with her the whole time. Adam was silent. Adam was passive. Adam was probably thinking, her mouth, her choice. If she eats this fruit, the entire burden is on her body, her choice. If she has this abortion, the entire burden is on her. And the problem with that is that Adam's silence and passivity, where Adam's job was to protect and provide and lead and serve and to leave a legacy that honored God, his failure to protect, his failure to provide, his failure to lead, his failure to serve left a legacy of death forever. And God didn't come looking for Eve. He came looking for Adam. And he said, "What did you do? And did you do the one thing I told you not to do?" And Adam said, "What men are saying now, good men will say this when it comes to abortion." Adam said, "You gave me this woman and she gave me that fruit. Therefore, it's your fault," right? Blame woman, blame God. So many times when I post videos calling men to action, calling men off the sidelines, calling men into the arena to fight for life, men will come out as victims and say, "This is women's fault," right? Blaming women for how we got into this position. And I think it's really important to note that at no point in time do I think that we give anyone a free pass. We don't give women a free pass in abortion, but we can't give men a free pass either. Like we don't get to sit on the sidelines and do nothing and then blame women for what's happening. if we know that it's wrong, right? Like we wouldn't stand in a store and watch, and I'm not comparing women to children, I'm just using an analogy. We wouldn't stand in a store and watch our children who were meant to lead steal, and then, when we get confronted by police, just blame them when we didn't do anything, when we knew it was happening and we saw it happening and we didn't do anything. It's our job to lead, and it's our job to lead and to protect and provide and to serve. And so I think it's really important to note that men don't get to sit this out. Men have to be active in this fight. Men have to speak boldly. And once men start speaking boldly, everyone else will follow. Our wives will follow. Our children will follow. Those men who look up to us will follow. Our communities will change. That is how grassroots works. And our communities will change, our churches will change, and our country will change. And it won't change until that. And so, this is the call, I think, to men to step up and to really take action and to join into this fight. And so that is what I think I would really call men to do, is to really just step up and enter this fight. And like, when I started practicing law, there was there was an attorney who just like didn't like how fast my practice was growing. And he'd been doing it for 30 years. And for some reason, I don't know, he felt threatened, which I wasn't a threat. Like, I was learning how to do this. But I talked to a mentor of mine, and what he said was that one of the best pieces of advice he ever got was, picture them as a clown, because you don't get mad at clowns for doing clown things, right? Like, you expect a clown, I'm talking about a literal circus clown, to do crazy things, weird things, wacky things. And you don't get mad at them for doing things that no other person would do, because it doesn't have any reason or logic or make any sense. Like, you don't get mad at a clown for doing clown things. And I think that sometimes that's how we have to look at the opposition, instead of having fear about the things they're shouting at us, because they're not real. The things they're shouting at us aren't true, and we can be grounded in truth, balanced with compassion. And I think that is how we can move forward and be bold, is to not take the opposition seriously, because they're being led by a different force, and that force is not truth. And so I think that is the easiest way to not doesn't help to call them a clown, because then we're starting a fight that doesn't need to happen, but just ignore it, because it's not real and it's not grounded in truth. And get out there and speak truth boldly, and take action, and lead in this fight. And there are so many resources to really become equipped and to learn, how do we do that? Like how do I have this argument, in a way that I can win without getting frustrated, and still be balanced with compassion. And look, when it comes to masculinity and the pro-life movement, there are other voices right now that are being very effective in getting people to come to action. The issue that I have with some of these voices is that their view of masculinity is in opposition of the feminine. Their view of masculinity is, the reason we haven't won this fight, look, going back to what I said about Adam blaming Eve, the reason we haven't won this fight in the last 53 years is because women have been leading it, right? And women don't lead the way men do, because men and women are different. Um, and I think that is ill placed. Like, that's a distorted view of masculinity. I think that we don't get to sit back and say, "Hey, ladies, thank you for all the work you've done for the last 53 years while we've sat out. You haven't finished it, so you can go back to the kitchen, and we will take over from here," which is literally what some of them are saying. So I think that that's a distorted view of masculinity. You know, the women who have been leading this fight have done it in the best way that they could, and have done a great job and created systems and things that men never would have done. Pregnancy centers would not exist if men had been leading the pro-life movement from the beginning, because that's not how we think. And so all of this had to happen the way that it happened so that we can now step in and not lead, in exclusion of the women who are leading, but lead boldly alongside of the women who are leading in the pro-life movement. Because as I said before, masculinity and femininity are not competitive, they're complementary. And together is how we will win this fight. We're not going to win this fight by kicking the women out and men taking over. We will win this fight by joining forces and fighting alongside each other. And so that's my encouragement to all of the men who are listening, especially, and even all the women who are listening to, it's not up to women to get their husbands to lead, but I think we all know that women have great influence. You know, we want to, as men, lead and be respected and be appreciated by the women in our lives. And so, if we're prompted to step forward, that prompting means a lot. So that's my call to action to all the men and all the women who are listening. Let's get the men out there. Let's get them mobilized, to use your words. Let's get them educated. This is one way to educate. There's so many resources, and I'm sure we can share those at some point, for men, especially, to get educated so that we can be equipped and go out and speak boldly and fight confidently for life, family, and faith.
That was incredible. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. It it can't get easier to share that story, no matter how many years go by. And I was listening to you, and I know deeply that your son Michael is honored, and his soul is honored every time you put one foot in front of the other and do this work. And I'm so glad that on that airplane you listened to that call that you said was so loud and impossible to ignore. And I'm just so glad that you are in this, and you are leading now, Sean. And I'm just very grateful for you and your experience. And again, it cannot be easy, and your lived experience cannot have been easy, but it is clearly part of a plan. And so thank you very, very much for what you do.
It was a great decision. Like, God knows what he's doing, right? Like, this is
Truly,
not what I
you
wanted to
should.
do, but
Yes.
I am absolutely, my family is closer. My children come with me when I speak. Michelle gets to go with me sometimes when I speak, and so we really get to live this out together. And that's why I quit practicing law, is because I was really good at being a lawyer, and I was really bad at being a lawyer and being a present husband and a present father. And that was more important to me. So now I get to be present and bring them into it, and look, and that's one way we change the culture, right? That
That's
that
right.
is that is where it starts. And I've never actually thought that part through, but
Yeah,
as I'm calling on other men to lead, in their marriages and in their family, it happens to be exactly what I'm trying to do.
that's absolutely right. You're living what you are speaking, and that's incredibly important when it comes to integrity and credibility. So yeah, it's all working out clearly how it's intended to. So a couple questions. Uh, you mentioned early on in your story that your girlfriend had said to you, nothing you can say will change my mind.
Right.
And that at that same time, all you knew to say was no,
Right.
no, don't do it. Between then and now, and all of um, your evolution, I guess, and you're coming to grips with what happened, and now as you advocate and advise others, do you have a couple of statements to equip men that you believe are effective in that moment? So if, God forbid, a man watching this, or a younger boy, is ever in that situation, what is what is something that can be said and at least that that might have a chance of saving that woman's future health, mental health, physical health, and also
Yeah.
saving that life.
Yeah, so I'm going to draw on the work that I've done with the Vitae Foundation. The Vitae Foundation just finished their men's study, and it comes off the heels of other studies, so they can kind of put it all together. But the first thing is that the mother isn't worried about the baby, and I think that to fight for the baby, this is going to sound counterintuitive until I get to the end, but to fight for the baby, um, is fighting in opposition of what the mother's fighting for, right? The mother is concerned about how is she going to do this? Is she going to be alone? Is she going to? Let me start, I'm sorry, by saying the absolute worst thing that anyone can say is, I will support your decision no matter what you do. Because I will support your decision no matter what you do, it doesn't mean anything. It means I'm putting the entire burden of this decision on you. That's what mom hears, is I'm putting the entire burden of this decision on you. And as a man or as a woman, if you hear from the man who you have a child with, I'm putting the entire burden of this decision on you, then what you also hear is, I'm going to put the entire burden of everything else on you. Like I can't even make a decision about a baby, right? Like how am I going to be able to trust that man to help me financially, to help me, relationally, to help me emotionally, to help me spiritually? Like how can I trust him to help me at all if he's in our very first big situation telling me the entire burden is on me? So I think it's important to recognize that we've been conditioned to say that your body, your choice, or whatever you want to do, I'll support whatever you want to do, by the opposition. Like that's who conditioned us to say that. They did it under the guise of we're giving all the power to the mom, but the reality is we're putting the entire burden on the mom, and that's one of the fears that she has. So mom is scared about, how am I going to do this financially? How am I going to raise this child by myself? How am I going to, or am I going to have to raise this child by myself? Am I going to be able to finish the responsibilities that I have? How is this even possible? And so those are the fears and concerns that the father needs to address. And sometimes it's just a level of confidence that we're going to make this work. I might not have all the answers today, but I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to make sure that we make this work however I have to do it. And that is what it means to be a man. And that is something that has been lost, um, in so many ways by society because of the loss of male mentorship. Whether that's fathers in the home or I'm sorry, absent fathers, or divorces or whatever. Most, I think like 80% of single parent families are moms, and so I think that we really need to, we as in the men who are watching this, and men in, and when I say our generation, I use that very loosely to mean anyone over the age of 25. Okay, need to step up and mentor the next generations, whether that's indirectly by leading boldly with integrity, and outwardly, or directly by mentorship programs. Fatherhood programs at pregnancy centers. Every single one of them needs men to help facilitate those programs, to mentor those men. There are 2,700 pregnancy centers, so there are plenty of opportunities, for men to step into those mentorship roles. But that's one of the things we have to mentor them on, is the confidence to just to be a man, because nobody's ever showed them. And so I think that is something that, and that doesn't that doesn't go away at 25, right? When I took this position at Men for Life, which was a significant financial change from practicing law, you know, that was something, that was the same exact words that I had to say to my wife, is this is going to work. This is what God wants us to do. This is going to work. I don't know how, but this is going to work. And that confidence is what drives me to make sure that it works, and so So I think that is the most important thing that a man can say to a woman in that conversation is I promise you that we're going to figure this out and we're going to make this work, and it's going to be hard, but we're going to figure it out and we're going to make it work, and I'm not going to let you do this by yourself, and I'm not going to let us fail.
Excellent. And I would agree with every word of that. Yes. Thank you. Good. All right. Another question. How did you overcome any fear that you may have had as you stepped into this role and as you started to speak publicly on this issue? Because you just mentioned, getting involved takes a lot of confidence. Um,
Yeah.
how do you, and even now, what do you do to overcome the fear of being judged and labeled and being called every name under the sun?
The honest answer is I didn't want to do this in the first place, and this is what God told me to do. And when God wants me to not do it anymore, He will call me out of it. So I don't have any fear of that. I mean, there's things that happen that are frustrating, but it's not. My biggest fear, honestly, at this point is if I take one of my kids with me, making sure that they're safe. Like when I spoke in DC at the March for Life, making sure that I had my dad with me actually to stand with my son so that he wasn't standing there by himself. Like that's my biggest fear is that someone will attack my kids. You know, I'm I'm not worried because God validates what I'm doing every single day in so many ways, and 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 the other thing is like the opposition when it comes, especially to the words, to the conversations. They're so repetitive, and there's many times just so um, simple, that and people think like the what I get more than anything in the world is, or maybe I recognize it because I've adopted three kids, is if you're pro-life, how many kids have you adopted? But there's been posts like somebody went and found a picture of my family where one of my kids is biracial. Like it's clearly I've adopted children, and 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 asked that question. Like they're not even thinking this through. I had one post recently where I think over 100 people asked that exact same question. I just stopped answering. It's just silly. And Scott Klusendorf, who is a pro life apologist, took one of my posts and he was like, "Sean did a great job answering this. However, the real answer is it doesn't matter," and that's true. But that's the point, right? Is that what they're saying doesn't matter.
Right.
What matters is the truth, and they're coming from a position of lies. And when people are coming at you from a position of lies, you don't really have to have fear. The like I said at the beginning of this question, the biggest fear I have now, and this didn't even happen until Charlie Kirk, um, is that people are literally violent. My friend Rebecca Hagan spoke at an event at a pregnancy center banquet last week or the week before, and somebody in the wait staff volunteered for the event just so that they could rush the stage. And nothing, she's safe, nothing happened. But that is where we are today, and so that is the biggest fear. It's not the opposition has nothing to stand on, and so I think that it's moving into that mindset, right? That we are standing on truth
Yes.
and they are standing on lies. And therefore, we can have all the confidence in the world as we move forward because it's not true what they're saying. What they're saying doesn't, I don't want to say it doesn't matter because we do have to, if we're going to change the culture, we need to be able to speak to them as many times as we have to. But it's not real. So
Right.
I think I just trust God and I believe that God has me doing what He wants me to be doing, and if He didn't want me to be doing it, I would be doing something else. And so this is what I'm going to do to the very best of my ability.
Very good. I have one other question before we conclude. You mentioned the abortion pill, and it is right now the most prevalent means of abortion in our society. And we are learning every day that it is being used by men who have ill intentions, and they use that pill to coerce pregnant girlfriends or pregnant wives, or in some cases to outright poison their partners who are pregnant. So women are ingesting this drug without knowledge, and their children die as a result. If this video manages to make it in front of a man who is in a crisis situation, in an unplanned pregnancy situation, and you know, there is so much fear and doubt that floods a woman or a man when they are experiencing an unplanned pregnancy. And that is a human fear and a human doubt that can be overcome, but without those supports and without that partner or that counselor to walk side by side and provide the confidence that you just spoke about, the fear is so overwhelming that a quick fix sounds like the right fix. What would you say to a man who is contemplating using the abortion pill as coercion or as poison on his pregnant girlfriend?
That question in itself, raises a lot of emotions in me, like negative emotions, because that is the weakest thing that a man can do. You're not just killing a baby, and you can justify it however you want by saying it's not a baby, but that just denies science. But you are poisoning the woman who you have a relationship with, or at least had some semblance of a relationship with, and that's not. I mean, look, that's no different than stabbing her. I'm going to be honest. There's so much data now showing how the abortion pill um, negatively impacts the physical health of the women who are taking it. And so you're not only, it's like raping her. Like it really is, like you are doing something against her will, which negatively impacts her physical and mental health. Like you are taking control, and that is the absence of masculinity. Like that's no real man would do that. Like that is the weakest thing that anyone could do. And so, you know, I don't know, man. I don't know how to. It's one of those situations where to speak directly to a person who's considering that is similar to speaking directly to a person who's considering raping someone because they haven't gotten to have sex in a while. And so, that's how I would compare it. And, you're going to cause not only the death of your own child, but lasting physical and emotional impact on the mother of your child. And if you go through with that, I hope and pray that you are caught and that you face the stiffest penalties under the law. I don't have anything kind to say to that person. I'm sorry.
I would
Sometimes we just
expect
have to
there
speak
to be
truth.
kind words. That's and that's what I was going for, because this that aspect of this issue is only going to increase, I think. And those are the stories that need to be told, because there needs to be an awareness
Yes.
of that component and that
And that's another
dynamic.
reason that we need to get rid of the abortion pills.
Correct.
And look, and
Absolutely.
I do understand that the problem here is that misoprostol is used in things other than abortion. I believe it's used in miscarriage too, and in other health issues. And so that is where that is where you know, educating and mobilizing um, really
Yes,
comes into place. That is where leading in a way that your circle of influence follows and leads alongside of you. So their circle of influence follows, and we can, that's how we change the culture. You can't change the culture by just sitting around saying we're going to change the culture. You can't change the culture by just putting out articles. You know, you got to get out and do something, but people have to be able to see who you are as a person. It's just like how people convert to Christianity. They see something in someone that they want, and they ask that person, what do you have? Like, why do you feel this way? And when they get that response, they're like, well, I want to see what that's about. And it's the same thing in everything in life. It's, you can simplify it all the way down to how you choose what sports teams you follow. I really like this person, and he, he's a fan of whoever. I don't want to cite sports teams on here because we're in two different states, but he's a fan of whomever, and I like him, so I'm going to follow them too, right? Or he plays for this team, therefore I want to do the things that he does. Like leading is really important, and you can't lead from your couch, and you can't lead if you only you can't make a change if you only go to places that already agree with you. And I think that also goes to your question of how do I get past the fear of speaking in the opposition. And it's like I'm not going to change anything if the only people I'm speaking to are an echo chamber of people who already agree with me. Like like I have to speak to them. I
that's
have to
right.
get um, that negative opposition because that's the only way I know I'm reaching the people who can change. You don't change the culture by avoiding it.
That's right. And that's why it is so important, as you said, and as we're advocating too, the grassroots component of this, getting out into your communities, having the conversations, asking the questions, listening to the answers, and particularly with people who you don't necessarily agree with or who don't agree with you or see your perspective. Those are the difficult conversations that we all need to be having in order to really prompt change. So, um, Sean, thank you so much for presenting today once again. Is there a particular resource or website that our viewers can visit to learn more about your work?
Yes, menforlife.org is our website. And then our YouTube channel, which, as I said a couple times, men don't talk about abortion because men don't talk about abortion. So that's one of the initiatives that's important to me, is just continuing to have conversations.